مرحبا بكم في حوارات السياق. استعرض الرئيس الأمريكي جو بايدن في مقاله الأخير بصحيفة واشنطن بوست بعض أوجه السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية بالشرق الأوسط في ضوء زيارته، وكشف فيه أسباب رحلته إلى المنطقة خاصة إلى السعودية. للمزيد من المتابعة حول هذا الملف ينضم إلينا الدكتور حسين إبيش كبير الباحثين في مركز دول الخليج في واشنطن. دكتور حسين، مرحبا بك معنا.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
كيف ينظر في الولايات المتحدة لزيارة بايدن للسعودية؟
Well, I think that there are a number of different perspectives. I mean, I think, first of all, there are a lot of Americans who really don't understand international relations and don't care that much. And the only interest they have really is, could the price of oil come down? But it did come down. And they're noticing that at the pump, they're seeing the price go down. They're worried, could it go up again? They're hoping that he could get the Saudis and others to help by increasing production. But they don't really know even how that works. So there's a lot of disinterest. Then there are those who, of course, the Republicans have the job of attacking him, so they would be very critical no matter what, but within reason. Now there's the isolationist wing of the Republican Party, the Trump wing of the Republican Party, that really hates internationalism. They were kind of very sympathetic to Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. They don't really want the United States to be an engaged global leader. They do want to buy and sell from the Middle East. They want to sell weapons and they want to buy oil for cheap or what have you. That they like. But anything beyond that, they don't like. And then there's a left-wing part of the Democratic Party, which is maybe Biden's own biggest weakness here, which sort of agrees with that, doesn't like US leadership, and similarly is isolationist, and takes a strong view on human rights, especially when it comes to Gulf countries and other Arab countries. You have to get to the very far left of it before the question of Israel will come up, but even then it does. The only thing is these are small groups. So I think within the part of the American system that pays attention to international affairs and understands it at all, I think this is broadly popular. I think the people who have the idea that this is unpopular or that he's going hat in hand to these countries to beg them for help and this is embarrassing or defeat, that they don't understand how the United States works. This has every likelihood to be a success for Biden, even politically, where most Americans don't care about, foreign affairs.
بايدن ذكر في مقاله أن زيارته لبدء فصل جديد من مشاركة أمريكا بالشرق الأوسط. ما ملامح هذا الفصل؟ هل ستعود واشنطن إلى الانخراط أكثر في قضايا المنطقة؟
So I think it's complicated, right? And it's especially complicated because they're being very cautious in the White House. Biden himself was very cautious. The first time he spoke about his agenda, he said, this isn't about oil, it's about security and about Israeli security, and I have a plan. And then he stopped right in the middle of the sentence. He said, I have a program. That was the word he used. And then he stopped and he said, well, anyway, you'll find out more later. He has an idea that he has never fully articulated in public, but I think we know what it is. And that is the idea that the United States could re-engage in the Middle East in a very dynamic and effective way, at the same time drawing down from the legacy presence that has been inherited from 2013, 14, 15, in other words, from the era of the invasion and occupation of Iraq. The United States has these huge military bases, especially Al-Udeid in Qatar, but others, around the region, that it probably doesn't need, at least not in the same form, because it's not thinking of fighting conventional wars at the moment in that kind of a scale. It is certainly going to need the Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. And then that's the one big installation that isn't, I think, up for reassessment. But I think the idea is that the United States, coming off of the success the Biden administration has had in Europe, in reunited and reinvigorating the Western alliance, NATO, expanding NATO even to include now Finland and Sweden, and the kind of new profile, dynamic profile the US has as an international leader in a way that it hasn't operated in decades, many decades, that they could replicate that in the Middle East. Now, no one in their right mind is thinking about a formal alliance, a Middle East NATO or an Arab NATO or anything like that, anything even formalized, structured, institutionalized. No, that is not what's on the table. What is plausible, conceivably possible, because it would be in the interests of all parties, the United States and its regional friends, is a loose but powerful coalition. Coalition, not alliance, not institution. Even partnership is maybe too strong a word. For the beginning, it would be inching towards a coalition under an American umbrella, right, to cooperate and communicate more. And what you're really talking about here is the United States starting to serve as a hinge between countries that have generally sided with Washington because they are status quo powers and they are pro-stability and security. Coming together really to confront Iran, because Iran is the great threat right now in the region to stability and security. And the Vienna talks that moved to Doha, the indirect talks on the nuclear deal have basically failed. They have not succeeded, and Iran did not accept the obvious agreement of compliance for compliance. Now they want the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps taken off of the list of terrorist organizations, all kind of ideas that were never part of the nuclear talks. Basically, they want to sabotage the talks. They want to at least make it impossible to conclude them, right? And so that they're at a minimum, they're postponing a resolution. This is very reckless. It means the United States has no choice but to look at creating a new regime of containment and deterrence against Tehran. It also means that the United States now has no choice but to work with its regional partners who are basically in less of a pro-American and more of a contra-Iranian camp, right? So you have Israel, some of the GCC countries, some of the most important ones, right? Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, may or may not include Qatar. You can expect Oman and Kuwait to keep a low profile and stay out of it. I think the Qataris will have a hard time making choices, but the other four, right, certainly are all in on this. And possibly with the help of other Arab states, including Egypt, Jordan, and the government of Iraq at the moment, led by the prime minister there now, that they could work together in different ways, but coordinatedly. And this is the alternative to the American approach, a traditional American approach of the past 20 years, in two different ways. Number one, it would allow the United States to draw down its big footprint in the region militarily, except for regarding missile defenses and air defenses on the one hand, and the Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain. The freedom of the seas. In the Gulf waters themselves, in the Red Sea, in the Indian Ocean, you need the Fifth Fleet, no doubt. The rest of it could be downsized, and you could have a lot more smaller military bases of the United States spread out in the region to work with its partners in a different way, because the way the US has been working since the Iraq invasion, which was based on what Donald Rumsfeld said was, the mission makes the coalition. Right? In other words, you decide what you want to do, and then you see who will help you. This is the other way around. You're going to have a coalition and then see how the different countries can work with it and benefit from it in different ways. You would obviously expect very different things out of Israel than you would out of Bahrain, and very different things out of Egypt than you would out of Iraq, or out of Jordan than Saudi Arabia. These are different countries with different interests. The point is, the United States now can imagine a scenario where all of them could work together in a loose but potent coalition. First, to stymie Iran in the short run and build up their own strength together. And then secondly, in the long run, from Washington's point of view, block or limit China's growth of influence among these states. It's alarming to the United States that when it came to Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, Israel, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia all didn't really want to side with the United States. They were trying to stay out of it. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. They didn't want to vote in the UN, et cetera. And they had to be coerced into doing that. And that reflects an imperative of strategic diversification and moving beyond an reliance on Washington that the US finds alarming, because it opens the door more for China in the long run than for Russia. So these are the goals.
عظيم. هذا ما أود أن أسألك عنه. هل علاقات دول الخليج بروسيا والصين لها بعد استراتيجي، أم أن الأمر فقط مرتبط بمدى التزام الأمريكيين بالمنطقة؟
So that's an excellent question. No, I think it is very much aimed at China in the long run. Right now, there's an immediate need from the American point of view to answer Iran's refusal to come to terms on the nuclear issue. And you look today, there was a joint declaration in Jerusalem from Israel and the United States. And the most important sentence is that the United States reaffirms its commitment that Iran will never gain a nuclear weapon and is willing to use all the different power in its ability to make sure that doesn't happen. This is the most direct threat against Tehran of a military response to its nuclear ambitions under Biden, and really for a long time. I mean, you have to, I think, discount Trump's, threats on Twitter and whatnot. It is not really policy. This is a carefully considered policy statement warning Iran you would not agree reasonably in Vienna and Doha. You would not come to terms. So if you are, and now your big argument is not with us, it's with the International Atomic Energy Agency. You take down its cameras, you can't explain the nuclear residue they found. You're not arguing with us, you're arguing with the world. Now you seem to be moving in the direction of a nuclear weapon. We want to make sure you don't think that just because we are not chest-beating militarists like Donald Trump, and just because we want to change to a lower profile in a way in the Middle East, in a way a higher profile, in a way a lower profile, as I was describing, that you don't have the delusion that we won't use military force to prevent you from getting a nuclear bomb. We will. And they've said it very, very clearly. Now, they've said it in the context of Israel. They've said it to please the Israelis and placate the Israelis. But it's a message that also carries through into the Gulf. Because, of course, on Friday, Biden is going to Jeddah to meet with the King Salman and Mohammed bin Salman, and then he's going the next day to this, still in Jeddah, the GCC +3 summit. And so he's telling the whole region, not just Iran, look, I'm serious. I'm serious about this. I wouldn't say this if I didn't mean it. I'm not tweeting some nonsense in the morning. This is a real thing. So that really is the immediate American concern. In the broader sense, I think you're right. It is less concern about Russia, but definitely in the long run, the growth of influence of China is something the United States has to avoid. The United States has been the decisive power in the Gulf region. And I think sensible Americans understand that the US has to be the main outside actor in the Gulf if it wants to remain a primary international arbiter. If it wants to be the guarantor of the global order, it cannot leave the Gulf to chance or to local parties, Iran, Saudi, whoever, fight it out, or open the gateway to China and India and maybe even Russia, who knows, to come in and fight over it. No, the US has an opportunity to repair the damage that has been done with its regional partners, building on the new opportunities that Ukraine presents, on the new opportunities that arise out of the Abraham Accords and the possibility of a big umbrella in a loose way, on an informal way under the United States to bring these countries together, and also to keep very much the base in Bahrain. I want to stress the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain remains essential. There are people in the United States who say it isn't, but they're wrong. I think clearly it is. So you have a lot to work with here, that this could be a very historic visit for the United States. On the other hand, there are reasons it might not be.
ذكرت أن هناك سلبيات لزيارة بايدن، ما هي؟
Okay, there are two. One is they are going asking an arithmetic question, an addition, a sum, adding the US plus Israel. And I'm going through the itinerary, right? The US plus Israel, plus the Palestinians, plus the Saudis, plus the GCC, then plus the three, Egypt, Jordan, and the government of Iraq, equals what? That's the question. What comes after the equal sign, after all those numbers and pluses? If the answer is not much, then the US has to go back to the way it's been doing business for the past 20 years, which is meet every challenge with an ad hoc arrangement bilaterally with its different partners. I work with Saudi Arabia here, I work with UAE here, I bring in these guys here, I bring that one here, I work with the Israelis here, do it like that. Or if the answer is definitely something, then the US has an agenda over the next year or two or three or more to build this coalition. If after the equal sign, after all those pluses and the equals is something, there's something there, then they will know. So one way it could go badly is if they find out there's no real appetite for this in the region, that the countries are not willing to cooperate or to give up their independent decision making, that they're not willing to get into this kind of an arrangement, which has costs as well as benefits. Then it hasn't achieved much, and maybe you'll get bilateral things, you get some more understanding with the Saudis on oil, maybe you get some kind of an agreement on security with the Emiratis, on China, and then you have some business of missile defense with the Israelis and what have you, but it won't be a big deal. Right? The other way it can go wrong, and here it could go spectacularly wrong, is if the meeting between President Biden and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman goes badly. This is possible because there may be a gap in expectations. Right? They are going to meet. That's good. Biden may think, I'm meeting with him after a long time of not wanting to meet with him because of Jamal Khashoggi and other objections and complaints I have. Now I'm willing to meet with him in public and be photographed. That should be enough. We know from the Saudis' own press releases and statements that MBS expects to be having a long discussion with Biden after a perfunctory head of state meeting between the king and the president. Then I think the way the Saudi texts look, it looks like then you transition into a head of government to head of government meeting, because Biden is both head of state and head of government. But Mohammed bin Salman is basically head of government, not head of state, but sort of like a prime minister, a daily, day-to-day authority in Saudi Arabia. Not the ultimate authority, but kind of the functional policy authority. And he's gone in there. They've published a big list of issues they want to discuss. The US has kind of implied they have a different list that might be more, it doesn't attend to this meeting, but they've spoken about much less important things in the past about that could be an idea. And it could be that Biden might want to keep the meeting short and simple and just meet him and be done with it and then go on to the GCC plus. Whereas the Crown Prince may feel that he needs a few hours touching on many important issues because these are important things, and he would have a point, he'd be right. If the Crown Prince feels slighted, if he feels not respected, if he feels misled, or somehow that he was just treated in a perfunctory way, he might not like it. And in a monarchy, personality is even more important than in a democracy with the president. They're both important, but it becomes even more important when you have a system like Saudi Arabia. If someone in the position of the king or the crown prince is personally offended, it could be a problem. And it could take months or a year or two to fix that between the Biden, not between the US and Saudi Arabia, but between the Biden administration and the royal court as it is now in Riyadh. And so that is one potential pitfall. I hope and I expect that US diplomats have succeeded in the hard work they've had more than 3 weeks to do in making sure that expectations for that specific meeting between those two men, the aging American president and the young dynamic Saudi crown prince, are commensurate with each other, are compatible. Because that is a pitfall I think is underappreciated.
سأقتبس منك عبارة فارق التوقعات. في الحقيقة هناك فارق في النظر إلى الأمور وإلى ملفات المنطقة. إدارة بايدن تحاول اختصار حرب اليمن مثلا في شقها الإنساني وتجميد الصراع، بينما هي حرب وجودية للسعودية المنخرطة في حدود مع اليمن. هل ستقرب الزيارة وجهات النظر؟
It's a very good question you asked, which is what, there's a gap in priorities and perspectives here between two countries that are really independent. And you're right, that for the United States, there is a strategic element to the Yemen war, which they think can be handled, not satisfactorily, but adequately in the short run by a truce, which they have managed to convince Saudi Arabia to uphold despite endless provocations from the Houthis. This is a big favor the Saudis have done for the United States, because left on their own, I think Riyadh would not have endured a lot of these Houthi violations. But I think you're right. I think that there's a gap in not just expectation, a gap in perceptions and in policy needs. So one of the things that needs to happen is a bigger understanding the coming out of this meeting, which would be that, all right, so the US wants the Yemen war to end. Saudi Arabia also wants the Yemen war to end, but they have different ways of conceptualizing what is acceptable. Fine. I think if the US were to make a sincere commitment in writing and formally to Saudi Arabia's basic national security, right, and the national security of other countries in the Gulf region of for example, of the UAE, which is particularly vulnerable to missile attacks. Saudi Arabia has strategic depth based on its size of its population and its country, and it can survive missile attacks. Israel has strategic depth in the form of its nuclear arsenal, especially if it has submarine launch, second strike arsenal, which we think it probably does. But even if it doesn't, it still has that. UAE has no strategic depth at all, really, and it needs more support than it's been getting. So there are a number of key partners in this attempted coalition that need to hear very different things out of Washington for their own, as you put it, existential security, for their survival, right? And whether it's in the context of Yemen, whether it's in the context of a more direct confrontation with Iran, or with Iraq, or many other threats to their security, that the United States is not simply going to be asking and not giving the way that has been since the Biden came in. I mean, I understand the Saudi perception about the Biden administration since the inauguration of Biden has been the Saudis have, that the Americans under Biden have asked, and Saudi Arabia has generally said yes to some of those are big things, some of those are small things. The biggest one is Yemen, because as you say, it's not optional for Saudi Arabia to have security on its border and on its southern border. It cannot have these Houthis launching missiles and cross-border raids and things. This is not acceptable. So I understand that. But I think now is the time that the Americans are proposing something bigger. I think they are. It seems like they are, for its partners, wherever they are in the Middle East, to say, but here's what we need. Here's what we're willing to do, and here's what we need from you. And if the U.S. is going to want to try to rearrange itself as the broker between regional powers that mainly look after their own security, and the U.S. role there is mainly in coordinating, is in intelligence, is in air defense and missile defense, and in the seas, right, and naval. That's really the U.S. role. And I think that's a very good plan. It's got to be willing to offer a great deal in exchange for the cooperation it's asking for, especially from Gulf countries that are vulnerable. Saudi Arabia is very vulnerable because of the Houthis in Yemen. UAE is very vulnerable to the missile threats all around it. So these things need to be answered.
هناك أفكار جديدة عن التطبيع بمناسبة الزيارة، منها تحالف عسكري وآخر اقتصادي. ما مدى واقعية هذه الأفكار؟
Right now, probably small steps. Yes, because I think there are some things we can see would almost certainly be successful. The question of, for example, Israeli-Saudi formal understandings, diplomatic exchange regarding Tiran and Sanafir, it's almost necessary. And it's not new. Since the Egyptians agreed to transfer control of the islands back to Saudi Arabia, it has been clear, because they are specifically mentioned in the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, and the Israelis have rights, navigation rights, regarding those islands that are part of that agreement from 1979, that Saudi Arabia regaining control over its islands it needs to respect those treaty obligations. If not, they would throw the whole thing into chaos, and they wouldn't want to do that. So there is going to be that understanding. The United States wants to use that reality to make a more formal dialogue, and process, and that's good. I think that's smart. Overflight rights or privileges for Israeli aircraft is another one. Other aspects of navigation, I think you really could see more work on the multilateral freedom of navigation, anti-piracy, anti-terrorism coalition that's based in Bahrain. It's adjacent to the headquarters of the Fifth Fleet. It's a 45-nation consortium. And the Israelis have now got a military officer permanently stationed in Manama or outside Manama in that headquarters. And I think it's another example of the kind of step that the Saudis and the Israelis can take to get together. There are many others. They have to do with commerce, they have to do with security, they have to do with cooperation. And I don't think we're at the stage yet where a big step can be taken. One of the reasons is you have to have a clearer path from where we are to where we're going to go before that makes sense. The second thing is you need to figure out what, for their own security purposes and political and diplomatic purposes, Saudi Arabia needs regarding the Palestinians from the Israelis. And it's not going to be zero. It's not going to be the same sort of understanding that UAE and Bahrain achieved over, okay, no more annexation for the next 5 years or 6 years or something. It's got to be something more serious. That means it's really important to have Palestinian buy-in. And there are many ways of incentivizing the Palestinians to accept something they're not going to like. I guarantee you they're not going to like it because it's not going to get them where they want to go. And they're going to feel it even in their own way of thinking weakens their hand. I don't think they're right about that, but that's how they're going to think. But you can still incentivize them with multiple different provisions that benefit the PLO, the PA, and the Palestinian cause. Without achieving fully the end of the occupation or anything like that. The question that needs to be asked is three. Number one, what is Israel willing to give? And what can the Israeli Knesset and the Israeli body politic, whether it's a Netanyahu government or a Lapid government, a Bennett or some other Ayed Shaked government, whoever it is, the Knesset basic equation is the same, and it's not easy for them to give anything to the Palestinians because now they could be to get access to the Saudi, they might be willing to, but it's hard. So you have to find out what the Israelis are willing to give. The second thing you need to discover is what do the Saudis minimally think they need in order to defend themselves internationally at the Islamic global level, the Arab regional level, and to make sure that it's acceptable politically to the range of constituencies inside Saudi Arabia. It's a country of more than 30 million people, huge country. This is not a small city-state or a little country. It's a big country with many constituencies. They have really intense politics there. So the third thing you need to ascertain is what will the Palestinians accept? In other words, not to be happy about necessarily, but to acquiesce to not sabotaging this, that they would not make you reject it and spit at it and make a big thing about how they hate it. If you can find an answer that comes close to meeting all of those, that the Palestinians can live with, that the Saudis can live with, and that the Israelis can deliver, then you have a direct path. If you can't find that, it becomes difficult. And you have to then ask, could you go around the Palestinian issue? And it becomes harder for the Saudis to do that. And it raises the cost, of normalization, and it changes the calculation.
في الختام لابد أن أسأل عن زيارة بوتين لإيران ولقائه بأردوغان ورئيسي بعد 48 ساعة من زيارة بايدن للسعودية. هل من ترابط هنا؟ هل من تنافس؟
Yes, of course. Russia is directly in competition with the US in the region, and so is China. China is a much slower process. China is playing a long game. And they are doing a transition from being a mercantile power that buys and sells and especially is a consumer of oil into one that's more engaged infrastructurally, that's starting to look for inroads into a military presence, but very gently. And it's going to take many decades. China militarily, in terms of its projection, is still struggling to stamp its authority over the South China Sea and the North China Sea and Taiwan and these areas, Vietnam, right next to them. So they are not really in a position to be a dominant actor or even a broker in the Middle East now, in the Gulf region now, but they will be potentially in the future, potentially, right? They are the most obvious competitor to the United States in the long run. So that's clearly competition. Russia, yes, Russia is trying to be a competitor to the United States, and it asks very little, and it has created off of the success that Russia and Hezbollah and Iran had in rescuing the Bashar al-Assad regime with their joint intervention in the fall of 2015, the idea that Russia is reliable and the United States is not, that Russia delivers to its partners and the United States is not, that Russia is loyal and the United States is not loyal. I think a lot of this, though, has been very damaged by the performance of the Russian military and the Russian state in Ukraine. Russia now looks like a country that is much more powerful on paper than in reality, that it can do okay fighting against various militia groups and the SDF and Islamists and Al-Qaeda and whoever, ISIS and what have you in Syria, and particularly against the SDF groups that were their main opponents. But look, in the end, when they go up against a much smaller but real military, they didn't perform very well. They really didn't, and they failed in their attempt at regime change in Kiev. So, also, I think you have to look at, anyone serious has to look at the way in which the Russian government was not able to be honest with its people, to even use the word war, to have a policy that's coherent, to be able to explain to its country what it's doing. It doesn't look very good. So I would say that right now, clearly, the anti-status quo powers in the region and the world, led by Russia and China, globally, and in the Middle East by Iran, and then there are others who sign on to this, like the government in Syria and others, some of the Iraqi groups, etc. And down the line, that these countries look good to each other. They look like good partners. They share goals of changing the regional order, disruption, and all of that. I think it's going to be very hard for a serious Saudi government, Emirati government, Bahraini government, Israeli government, even a Jordanian or especially an Egyptian government to say, that looks good to me. That sounds like what we want. We want to do that. We want to break things and rearrange things. And we don't like the way things are. We want to fundamentally change them. And we don't mind employing terrorist groups and militias and bombing and all kinds of stuff, in disruptive stuff, to, as they say in Silicon Valley, move fast and break things, right? You can do that if you can get in bed with a group like the Houthis, if you're Iran, because you don't care if they do crazy things, and because it breaks stuff, it does harm, and you benefit from harm, you benefit from chaos. They benefit from the chaos in Iraq, from chaos in Syria, from chaos in Lebanon, from chaos in Yemen, from chaos in wherever it may be. They love that because it opens the possibility for their machinations and the Quds force to come in and play their games. Right, understood. Does this apply? How many other countries in the Middle East does this apply to as a rational strategy? I think very few. So ultimately, in my view, it would only be really an irrational conclusion from any of these countries to decide that Moscow is a good bet and the United States is no longer of interest, even frankly post-Ukraine invasion, to say, well, we should balance Moscow against Washington. I think that would be just crazy, honestly. I really do. I think you can say, well, we want to have as best relations with all these countries as we can. We want to have good relations with China, our main customer. We want good relations with Russia because it's still a force in the Crimea and the Black Sea and Eastern Europe. I understand. And with Washington, and we want to get as much out of everybody as possible. That's totally reasonable. That makes sense. But to the idea of kind of moving away from the United States or not accepting a US offer of stronger engagement in order to preserve ties with Mr. Putin, makes no sense to me. It really doesn't.
شكرا جزيلا لك الدكتور حسين إبيش على المشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق. مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.